to the audience, there's a very powerful term that you're using that comes from C. Wright Mills' books, The Power Elite. What is the power elite, and what are the institutions that make it up particularly?
Sure. So there is in the early 20th century, you ask a historian a question, they always say it's more complicated and started earlier. So there were three theorists around the turn of the 20th century: Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca, and Robert Michels. And they were theorists of the elites. Elite theorists. They developed something called the elite theory of democracy, or the elite theory of politics, and this notion of circulation of elites. And they had different exact opinions, but broadly speaking, that they were very influential in arguing that elites were really the most important members of modern society, that elites had the power, and that they were contraposed to this thing called the masses, which first began to be theorized in the late 19th and really in the early 20th century. And so this is later taken up by someone like C. Wright Mills, an American sociologist, actually very influenced by German sociology. It was really German sociologists, actually, like the guy I wrote my first book about, Hans Speyer, people like Emil Lederer, people like Siegfried Krakauer, who started theorizing in Germany this notion of the power elite, and sort of trying to refigure Marxist theory, which is effectively between classes, in light of elite theories of democracy. And so these guys were exiled by the Nazis in the 1930s. C. Wright Mills is is educated, I think, in the late 30s or 40s. I used to know this by heart, but I don't any longer. C. Wright Mills, if I remember correctly, was Hans Goethe, who was a German sociologist, actually translated Weber, like selections of Weber, came out in a book, I believe, called From Max Weber. And so Mills is very engaged with this German tradition of sociological thinking that focuses on the elite. And so he basically writes a book in I think it's 59. Is it 59 or 60 or 62? Power Elite is 56. Okay. So he writes a book in 1956 titled The Power Elite, which really doesn't applies these Weberian German insights into the 1950s Cold War United States. And he argues that power elites, military elites, political elites, economic elites are really the crucial, or at least are a very crucial part of the ruling of why society functions as it does.
I see exactly. And basically, your argument is that they have been the crux of the policy progenitors in the United States for pretty much over a century, and they intentionally made that so by shifting away the ability of the demos, so the members of the Democratic members of society, from having an influence on politics, which is the
Well,
largest part.
right, and this is sort of the ironic consequence of the New Deal, is that you can think about the institutions made in the late 1940s, the National Security Council, CIA, DoD, Council of Economic Advisors, these alphabet soup agencies, which were really influenced by progressive era thinking about managing the world, like literally using experts and centralized institutions in the government to manage the world. So if the first New Deal was about the social democratic compromise in the domestic political economy, this second New Deal of the late 1940s was really about creating a institutional basis of global politics. And so I think what those institutions do, what they had as one of their I think intended consequences, was that they helped make foreign policy into more of an elite sphere, a sphere where ordinary people wouldn't necessarily have as much influence. And there were a variety of reasons for this. I mean, in late World War II, early post-war period, there's a lot of social scientific studies that seem to demonstrate the ignorance of the masses, both of the masses in the United States, also the masses elsewhere. There's a bunch of labor agitation immediately after World War II, which really discomfited elites. There's this fear of the rise of the masses. And then there's this emergence of the Cold War. So elites understand the US-Soviet struggle as an existential one. And so they are worried that ordinary people aren't necessarily want to commit themselves to fighting an existential, potentially decades-long war with the Soviet Union. So they had to wall off foreign policy. And then, of course, there's a renewed resurgence of anxiety about communism, the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare, what have you. And so this really closes off the social democratic, let's say, trend that was emergent in the United States throughout World War II, which is, of course, one of the greatest instances of central planning of all time.
Interesting. So, how do we get from that point to the where we are today, with after the post civil rights era, in terms of the rise of Nixonian, the kind of merging of the getting off the gold standard and kind of the Nixon shock and all of that, moving into the neoliberal era? Does that further facilitate the push to the end of mass politics in terms of its utility, or does it in any way give birth to a new types of floundering mass politics with things like the attempts to challenge of, say, South African apartheid in the 80s, or other types of protests going into the say the first Gulf War, or maybe the war on terror. How exactly does this end of mass politics manifest itself in the post civil rights era?
It's a good question. So the most important thing is that the draft is ended, or I think more specifically, the draft is not renewed. So that effectively removes the bourgeoisie totally from fighting in their empire's wars. Vietnam, obviously engendered a lot of campus unrest, and so one of the compromises was that now it was going to be an all volunteer force. So people who didn't want to fight weren't going to have to fight in America's wars. So that's a huge thing. I think the end of Bretton Woods allows for the emergence of financialization, and as the profit rate continues to fall from the 1970s onward, as deindustrialization happens and more of the economy progressively becomes basically just in a fake world of numbers and calculations, the technocratic skills, the math skills, quantitative skills required to operate in that world make it further difficult for ordinary people to basically exert claims and exert influence in the economic sphere. So the economy gets further pushed away from the ordinary person's influence, which is, of course, later manifested in the neoliberalism of Carter, Reagan, and beyond. So I think those two structural transformations really set the stage for what happens in the war on terror and beyond, which is that Americans are not really going to fight in those wars. These wars are for technological reasons, and the American obsession, as Sam Moyn has charted, with making war more humane. Not only are not people not going to fight in these wars, but there's going to be robots who are fighting in these wars. And I think that basically the major decisions were made earlier, but by the time of the war on terror, there was a whole system that was allowing these types of decisions to be made almost without any reference to public opinion. I mean, look at the Iraq War, those protests. Look at basically any foreign policy thing that people protest. It doesn't really matter. Look at the response to the Great Recession. Totally helped finance and Wall Street. Didn't help ordinary Americans. We even though we vote, we don't live in any stretch of the imagination economic democracy. And so I think there are these serious drawbacks to the end of mass politics, even though we find ourselves here today.